The desert sun in June 1941 rose like a blade, cutting through the early morning haze over solemn Egypt. And the British Infantry Company dug into the rocky ground felt that familiar dread that came whenever the earth began to tremble. It wasn't artillery. It was engines. 6 German panzers, hulking silhouettes crawling across the desert floor, their armor glinting pale under the newborn sun. The platoon lieutenant raised his binoculars as if hoping the glass would tell him something different. It didn't. The tanks kept coming. Slow. Inevitable. Death on treads. He shouted for the anti-tank rifle team, and 2 exhausted men dragged forward that absurd 55-pound steel monstrosity the army had told them could stop armor. The boy's rifle. The weapon that had won trials in peacetime tests on thin plates and soft targets. The hope of 1939, now a joke in 1941. They planted the bipod in the dirt, leaned into the recoil pad, and sighted on the lead Panzer III at just under 200 yards. The loader slapped the bolt shut. The gunner whispered a curse, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The half-inch tungsten core punched out of the barrel, kicked sand into the air, and struck the tank dead center on the glacis. The sound was wrong. A dull slap instead of steel tearing. When the dust cleared, the hull showed only a dent, shallow, unimpressive, meaningless. The round ricocheted away like a pebble off a train. The Panzer didn't slow. Its coaxial machine gun flickered, stitching the earth with bright sparks and whipping sand over the British line. 4 minutes later, that company was shattered, fleeing, bleeding, or silent forever. And that wasn't misfortune. It was normal. It was what Allied infantry faced from 1939 to early 1942. Tanks that nothing they carried could kill. German engineering had sprinted ahead. The Panzer III wore 50 millimeters of armor. The Panzer IV fronted 80. When the Tiger appeared, it brought 100 millimeters of hardened steel to the battlefield, steel that sneered at rifle fire and laughed at grenades. Meanwhile, the Allies fielded weapons designed for a different war. The boy's rifle, Britain's pride in 1937, shattered collarbones and bruised shoulders, but not tank armor. On paper, it punched 21 millimeters at 100 yards. In combat, its real figure was half that, maybe less. American infantry at the time had even less. Their official anti-tank weapon was a 50 caliber M2 Browning, excellent for trucks and infantry, useless against a Panzer's hide. Some units trained with sticky bombs, bags of nitroglycerin on exposed fuses meant to cling to armor. To use one, a man had to sprint through machine gun fire, slam it onto the tank's hull, and hope it didn't detonate early. Many didn't get that far. The British Piat, which fired a spigot-launched bomb using a brutal 40-pound spring, bruised ribs and jammed often. Its effective range was laughable. The French had rifle grenades that bounced. The Soviets used hand-thrown charges that required suicidal courage inside 30 yards. And commanders everywhere understood the truth. If a panzer division came at you, your only hope was another tank. Except your own tanks were usually burning by then. Allied reports from France in 1940 read like horror. Infantry lines crumbled not because men ran, but because nothing they carried mattered. The math was lethal. They brought 20 millimeter penetration to an 80 millimeter fight. The Germans had reinvented armored warfare with combined arms. Tanks advancing with infantry, artillery, and air cover in seamless coordination. If you were a 19-year-old rifleman in 1941, a Panzer wasn't a target. It was a death sentence, sliding across the earth toward you, engine roaring like fate. And so by early 1942, every Allied command sent back the same desperate plea. Give us something a man can carry that kills tanks, or we will lose this war, one infantry company at a time. The answer began with a pipe, a rocket, and two officers who were tired of burying soldiers. Captain Leslie Skinner had been experimenting for months with small rocket-propelled grenades. They were powerful enough to hurt a tank, but the backblast tore up the thrower's hand, arm, or face. Lieutenant Edward Ewell watched one of Skinner's rockets zip off unpredictably across the proving ground and muttered the question that changed everything. What if we don't throw it? What if we launch it from a tube? Skinner stared at him like he'd proposed building battleships out of cardboard. But both men were desperate enough to try anything that didn't kill its user on the first attempt. They grabbed a steel tube from the scrap heap, shaved it down to match the rocket diameter, plugged one end with a wooden stop drilled for a firing wire, and bolted on a crude wooden shoulder stock. The first test was a gamble, with an audience hiding behind sandbags. When the rocket fired, the tube didn't explode. The operator didn't die. The rocket didn't spin off and destroy a truck. It flew 60 yards and detonated close enough to the target to matter. The second flew wide. The third tumbled. But something important had happened. The concept worked. The operator lived. And Army Ordnance now had something that, with work, could become the infantry tank killer the world required. By summer 1942, it had an official designation, the M1 rocket launcher, and an unofficial nickname, courtesy of comedian Bob Burns's odd brass instrument, the bazooka. The warhead used a shaped charge, a brilliant physics trick that turned a copper cone into a jet of molten metal traveling at 20,000 feet per second, fast enough to punch through steel like butter. But the bazooka had a fatal flaw: accuracy. The smooth tube didn't stabilize the rocket. Every shot was a coin toss. A 50-yard hit rate around 40%, against moving armor often below 20%. In practice, that meant a bazooka team had one shot before the tank's machine gun answered, and if that shot missed, the team's story ended right there. By late 1942, Ordnance was on the verge of scrapping the entire program. Then a Swiss-born engineer named Henry Mohaupt presented a heretical idea. Rifle the tube. Cut spiraled grooves inside to spin the rocket like a bullet. Colonel William Crosley, head of the Aberdeen Proving Ground, rejected him instantly. Rockets weren't bullets. Spin could tear the warhead apart, and worse, the Army had already built 14,000 bazookas. Rifling meant scrapping them. Money burned, factories halted, timelines broken. Mohaupt didn't care. He knew the math. He knew shaped charges needed perfect perpendicular impact. Spin could guarantee that. And he had one more card. German intelligence reports confirming that the Wehrmacht's captured bazookas, reverse-engineered into the feared Panzerschreck, already used rifling. The enemy had embraced his idea before his own side would. Mohaupt went around the bureaucracy. Captain Skinner secured a direct briefing with General Barnes, who listened, nodded once, and ordered 3 rifled prototypes built immediately. Crosley hated the idea, but was overruled. And so the test was scheduled. January 28, 1943. Cold. Wind cutting across the Aberdeen Range. Real Panzer IV hull sections, recovered from North Africa, mounted at 50 yards. Clay backing to measure jet penetration. 20 shots from smoothbore M1s. 20 from Mohaupt's rifled tubes. 3 operators each, no excuses. The smoothbore results were exactly what soldiers in Africa and France already knew. Hits sometimes struck square, sometimes glanced off, sometimes missed wide. Penetration hovered around 4 inches, enough for thin armor, useless for the tank waiting to crush you. The rifled rounds told a different story. Shot 1, center hit, 7.2 inches penetration. Shot 2, 7.4. Shot 3, 6.9. Every rocket flew straight, nose first, spinning just enough to stabilize but not enough to destroy the shaped charged jet. Crosley demanded the engineers remeasure. They did. The numbers held. Then came the moment that cracked the room wide open. A rifled round hit the 8-inch test plate, the kind of armor you'd find on the Tiger's front, and punched straight through. The shaped charged jet melted steel like wax, blew into the clay block behind it, and sent flecks of metal into the observation bunker's slit 300 yards away. The range went silent. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of revolution. By the end of the test, rifled penetration averaged nearly 8 inches, double the smoothbore. Consistency variation dropped from 36% to 6%. Hit rate, 100%. Smoothbore probability of killing a Panzer IV, 15%. Rifled bazooka, 97%. A frightened teenager with a rifled tube could destroy the tank that terrified his whole company. In the meeting afterward, Barnes didn't hesitate. Rifle everything in stateside inventory, modify production lines, design field kits for deployed weapons. Do it now. Factories adapted. Rifling took 8 minutes per tube. 6 weeks later, the first batches shipped to Tunisia. Staff Sergeant Julius River proved the revolution on April 23rd, when his team fired at a Panzer IV from 70 yards and watched it explode in a bloom of fire. 1 shot, 1 kill. For the first time, infantry could breathe. After that, the weapon evolved quickly. The M1 became the M1A1, then the improved M9 with better sights and a 2-piece tube. At Salerno, bazooka teams shattered counterattacks before German armor could reach the beachhead. Rangers used them to crack open hardened emplacements. In Anzio, they crippled Tigers from the flank. Private James Arness, long before he became a Hollywood actor, described stalking tanks through rubble with the calm certainty that if he hit his mark, the bazooka would do the rest. On D-Day, 4 launches per company came ashore through smoke and surf, blasting through pillboxes and wrecking vehicles stranded on the shingle. In Normandy, hedgerows, bazooka ambushes became the salvation of isolated infantry caught without armor support. Forrest Guth of the 101st said it best. Before rifling, you fired and hoped. After rifling, you fired and knew. At Bastogne, surrounded and freezing, bazooka teams knocked out Panthers and assault guns at point-blank range, sometimes firing from second-story windows, sometimes from behind wreckage, always trusting the weapon in their hands. By war's end, bazookas accounted for over 800 confirmed German armor kills, and thousands more soft target eliminations that never made the reports. But the legacy reached even further. The 3.5-inch Super Bazooka, born in 1945, brought 11 inches of penetration, enough to punch through the sides of a King Tiger. Korea made it legend. Marine Corps and Army units held the Busan perimeter with bazooka teams that destroyed wave after wave of T-34s. In just 2 weeks, 1 regiment logged 41 tank kills. Later, the Law, the AT-4, the Dragon missile, all inherited Mohaupt's principle. Even modern recoilless rifles still spin-stabilized projectiles the way he proved necessary that frozen morning. Henry Mohaupt died quietly in 1981, his obituary barely mentioning the invention that changed infantry warfare. Captain Skinner retired a colonel. General Barnes received footnotes in ordnance history. But somewhere across Europe, the Pacific, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, countless soldiers survived because one engineer refused to accept good enough, when good enough meant men dying under tank treads. And in the desert, where the British infantry once watched rounds bounce uselessly off armor, a new truth had taken root by 1944. A tank was no longer invincible. A single man, steady hands, one shot, could end it. And when the war finally went silent, when the guns cooled and the smoke drifted off the ruined fields of Europe, the men who had survived walked forward, carrying more than scars. They carried the memory of steel monsters that once seemed unstoppable, and the memory of a simple tube of rifled steel that gave them back the power to fight. On quiet train rides home, in crowded troopships crossing the Atlantic, in the long, lonely nights after discharge, they remembered that first moment when a bazooka round streaked from the tube and struck true. They remembered the roar, the shockwave, the sudden bloom of fire, and the realization that for the first time since the war began, they were no longer helpless before tanks. It changed the war, yes, but it also changed them. It taught them that courage mattered. But courage without the right weapon was just another casualty report. It taught them that one idea, one impossible, rejected, ridiculed idea, could save thousands of lives. And it taught them that history isn't shaped only by generals or battles, but by ordinary men holding extraordinary machines in moments when everything hangs in the balance. Decades later, the world would pass by old bazookas displayed behind museum glass, their tubes scratched and worn, paint chipped, steel dulled by time. Most people would walk past without noticing. But to the men who had carried them, those tubes were more than relics. They were the reason they came home. They were the difference between being crushed under treads and standing again in the sunlight. They were proof that in the darkest hours, innovation could be as decisive as bravery. Somewhere in Switzerland, far from the battlefields his idea helped shape, Henry Mohaupt lived out his final years quietly, never mentioning the morning when physics, steel, and necessity converged to rewrite the fate of the infantryman. He never asked for medals, never sought recognition, never knew how many parents got to see their sons return because a rocket spun true. But the battlefield remembers, even when history forgets. It remembers the terrified 19-year-old crouching behind a stone wall as a tank closed in. It remembers the hiss of the rocket, the flash of light, the eruption of steel. It remembers the day the prey learned to hunt. And in that moment, the balance of war shifted forever. Because tanks may rule the battlefield, but a soldier with the right weapon can rewrite destiny. And in 1943, on a frozen range at Aberdeen, destiny spun for the first time.